The smell of dust and sandalwood hung heavy in the air as worshippers poured into the old stone mosque on the edge of Gaza City in the late 1960s. It was a Friday, the kind that turned the entire street into a river of bodies, sandals scraping over worn steps, murmured greetings mixing with the distant honk of taxis and the cries of vendors closing their stalls. Inside, the marble floor was cool under bare feet. Men lined up shoulder to shoulder, quiet, focused, some with their eyes closed already, lips moving in private prayer. Near the front, just 3 rows back from the mihrab, a man adjusted the cuffs of his pale gray robe. His beard was carefully trimmed, his kufiya pressed, his back straight with a practiced posture of someone used to commanding attention. To most in the room, he was Sheikh Khalid al-Masri, a respected preacher, a man who spoke about dignity and resistance, who helped widows and arranged scholarships for orphaned boys. Only a handful of men in the shadows near the rear door knew that to a small, secretive network, he was something else entirely. A Hamas commander, the architect of cells that had already drawn blood far beyond this city. On the men's side, a worshiper in a plain brown robe slipped in late, head down, a string of prayer beads coiled in his palm. No one noticed that his eyes never really settled on the imam. They moved instead along the lines, counting shoulders, checking angles, calculating sight lines to the front where al-Masri stood. In the women's gallery above, another figure in a dark abaya knelt, her face half hidden by the balcony lattice. She seemed to be praying, but beneath her scarf, a tiny microphone pressed against her jawline murmured a slow count. The first call to prayer echoed, bouncing off domed ceilings and carved stone. Outside, the street fell quiet. The mosque became its own sealed world, a breathing organism of hundreds of men bowing and rising in unison. The brown-robed man slid one step to the left, then another, closing the distance, every movement masked by the wave of worshippers shifting into place. He was so close now that he could see the faint scar beneath al-Masri's ear, the one recorded in Mossad files with clinical detachment. If this fails, a voice had told him in a safe house in Tel Aviv days earlier, you are not just losing a target, you are starting a holy war inside a house of God. As the congregation moved into sujud, foreheads pressing to the floor, the man in brown remained a fraction of a second slower, his hand tightening around the beads. Hidden within the string, invisible from more than an arm's length away, was the tool that would decide whether Operation Silent Minaret entered Mossad history as a masterpiece of audacity or a catastrophe that would burn across the region. The imam's voice rose, reciting verses that spoke of mercy and judgment. Inside the sea of bowed backs, the operative's heart hammered like a drum. One breath, another. In the next cycle of movement, he would have less than the space between 2 words of scripture to reach out, touch the back of a neck, and make a man die without a sound. To his family, Khaled al-Masri was the boy who had survived everything. He was born in a cramped, wind-beaten refugee camp in the late 1940s, after his parents fled their village with nothing but a broken suitcase and a rusted key to a house they would never see again. As a child, he slept on a thin mattress between oil drums and sacks of flour, waking each night to the clatter of loose tin roofs in the wind. He grew up queuing for water, learning early that the world did not hand him anything that was not fought for. As a teenager, he was the quiet one who memorized entire chapters of scripture, then slipped away to meetings in the back rooms of mosques and tea houses, where older men whispered about resistance. To the early networks that would later coalesce into the movement known as Hamas, he was the architect. He spoke softly, rarely raised his voice, but on paper he drew maps of roads and checkpoints, supply routes and safe houses, turning anger into logistics. He did not plant bombs himself. He chose who did, where they stood, and how they disappeared afterward. By the early years of that tense decade, his reach extended far beyond Gaza. Cells he had helped found were suspected in bus bombings in coastal cities and shootings on rural roads. Intelligence reports from military police, Air Force analysts, and border units piled up in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The same name kept surfacing under different spellings and aliases, like a watermark bleeding through. Each time they tried to pin him down, he slipped just beyond reach, moving under the cover of sermons and charity work, always framed by the sanctity of religious life. To his followers, he was a guide, a man who could speak for an hour about patience and faith, then spend the afternoon cutting through endless bureaucracies to secure medicine for a sick child. To the young men he recruited, he offered structure, purpose, and a story in which they were no longer background extras in someone else's tragedy. To Israeli intelligence, he was a slow-burning fuse leading to a larger explosion. Early Shin Bet reports described him as a strategic mind embedded in spiritual cover. Mossad analysts, looking outward across borders, saw something more. They saw an operator who understood that symbols were as powerful as explosives, that a sermon broadcast on crackling radio waves could recruit faster than any leaflet. For years, the file on Khaled al-Masri moved between desks, gaining thickness, but not a red line at the top. There were always bigger crises: wars on the borders, diplomatic flare-ups, hijacked planes. He remained, in bureaucratic language, under observation. That changed after a bus exploded on a road outside a sleepy coastal town in the late 1960s. Among the dead was the daughter of a senior official, a fact that never made it into the public communiques, but burned its way through the private calculus of power. Intercepts linked the operation back to a network al-Masri had nurtured. His name stopped being just ink on pages. It became a question repeated in closed rooms. How long can you watch a man who turns prayers into plans and not act? In one such room, far from the echo of any call to prayer, a Mossad director tapped the thick file with a finger and said quietly, "We keep striking at branches. This man is part of the trunk." The final shift from observation to elimination did not happen in a dramatic midnight vote. It happened over coffee and ashtrays in a windowless conference room in Tel Aviv, in the spring of a year the world would remember for protests and upheaval, and a handful of people would remember for a single line in a classified memo. Around the table sat a mosaic of power: a representative from military intelligence, a Shin Bet officer whose eyes looked permanently tired, a deputy foreign minister worried about headlines, and the Mossad operations chief who had long ago learned that the quietest decisions were often the deadliest. On the wall, a map of the coastal enclave was pierced with colored pins: red for attacks already carried out, yellow for plots disrupted, blue for places where assets had reported seeing Khaled al-Masri in person. A cluster of blue sat around one particular neighborhood, tightening like a noose. A mosque, old and respected, appeared at the center of the cluster. "The pattern is clear," the intelligence officer said, sliding a set of photos forward. "He avoids cafes, markets, anywhere he can be casually photographed. He travels with armed guards to weddings and funerals, the only place his security drops to almost nothing. He taps the faded image of the mosque courtyard. A blur of men in white robes is here for Friday prayers. He arrives with 2 bodyguards. They wait outside. Inside, he walks alone to the same row, the same spot, every week." The deputy foreign minister frowned. "You are suggesting an operation inside a mosque. Do you have any idea what that will look like if it ever comes out? We have enough accusations already. Desecration. Sacrilege." He let the words hang, imagining furious headlines from Cairo to London. "We are not talking about grenades or gunfire," the Mossad operations chief replied. His voice was calm, edged with steel. "We are talking about a surgical action. One man, one motion, no visible weapon, no stray bullets. A man collapses during prayer. By the time anyone realizes it was not his heart, our people are gone." A silence settled over the room. The Shin Bet officer lit another cigarette, hands steady. "And if something goes wrong, if a worshiper sees something he should not see, if a device misfires, you will have turned a prayer hall into a battlefield." On another floor, legal advisors debated phrases like act of war, and religious immunity. Somewhere else in the city, a rabbi quietly consulted on whether killing in a house of worship could ever be justified in defense of lives not yet lost. None of their names would appear in the final operational order. In the end, the calculus came down, as it often did, to a sentence no democracy likes to see written in ink. The strategic benefit of neutralizing the subject outweighs the potential diplomatic and religious fallout, contingent upon a method designed to mimic natural causes. The codename chosen was sterile, almost banal. Operation Silent Minaret. It appeared on a single sheet of paper, next to a line that turned theory into intent. Objective: termination of Khalid al-Masri inside primary sanctuary, without overt signature. Signatures were added beneath that line. Some hands shook slightly, others did not. In the margin of his own copy, the operations chief wrote a private reminder no one else would ever read. If we cross this line once, it will be easier to cross it again. They did not send a hit squad first. They sent note takers. For 6 consecutive Fridays, Mossad would later pretend did not exist, watched Khalid al-Masri as he walked from his narrow street to the mosque. Sometimes from the window of a tailor shop, sometimes from the back seat of a dented taxi, slowly crawling behind. Each week they recorded the same details: time of departure, route taken, who greeted him, where his bodyguards peeled away, how long he remained inside. They noticed small things that never made it into the official reports. The way he always slowed near a particular fruit stand to pat a child's head. The way he adjusted his robe before entering, smoothing down invisible creases as if armor were made of cloth and ritual. They noted that his 2 bodyguards stopped at the outer courtyard, removing their shoes and lingering by the entrance, eyes scanning the street rather than the prayer hall. Inside the mosque, Mossad's presence was quieter still. An asset planted years earlier as a humble caretaker now understood why his handlers had suddenly become interested in the exact rows where men stood, in the routes that older worshippers took to reach the front. He described how al-Masri favored the 3rd row from the front on the left side, close enough to be seen, far enough not to draw too much attention. How he sometimes led the prayer, but more often simply blended in his voice, one among many. They are not just watching where he goes, one analyst wrote in a memo. They are watching how he moves, what he trusts, and when he relaxes. In this case, relaxation looked like something small. The loosening of shoulders when he stepped over the mosque threshold, believing that walls and scripture and community formed an invisible shield no enemy would dare break. From these observations, a plan took shape. The operation could not involve an obvious weapon. No knives, no guns, nothing that would cause panic or blood on marble. The death had to be quiet, immediate, and plausibly natural. That meant getting within arm's reach at the exact moment when the room was most crowded, when hundreds of men were bowing and rising in unison, when any sudden motion could be swallowed by the choreography of worship. The solution came from a direction no one in the mosque would ever suspect. A medical consultant in a European capital who sometimes advised intelligence agencies on matters of ending hearts without leaving fingerprints. He proposed a device small enough to hide inside a hollowed-out string of prayer. Beads. A mechanism that could deliver a microdose of a fast-acting agent through the skin at the base of the neck. No elaborate chemistry was shared with the operative. He was told only one thing: touch, press, count slowly to 10, then walk away. They rehearsed on a rented floor of an empty office building far from any mosque. Volunteers played worshippers, rising and bowing as recorded recitations played from a speaker. The operative in the brown robe practiced adjusting his timing to the rhythm of prayer, blending a lethal gesture into a gesture of piety. They ran through contingencies. What if al-Masri changed his row? What if a child broke the line? What if a local policeman decided that day to join the congregation and ended up between them? If anything breaks the pattern, the operations chief reminded them, you abort. No improvisation inside a holy place. We are ghosts or we are nothing. By the end of the 6th week, the pattern held. Same route, same bodyguards, same row. Only one variable remained uncontrollable. The will of a man who believed his safest place was the space between verses. On the chosen Friday, the city woke under a sky the color of worn linen. The air carried the metallic smell of the sea and something else the worshippers could not name, the electric charge that precedes a storm or a moment that will later be remembered as a hinge in history. Khalid al-Masri left his house at his usual time, trailed by his 2 bodyguards. In nearby alleys, people who seemed like ordinary neighbors adjusted their routines by a few minutes, ensuring that no one important stood where they needed to stand. The man in the brown robe arrived at the mosque early, slipping into the 3rd row, left side, claiming the exact spot where al-Masri normally planted his feet. When the commander entered, a small swirl of deference around him, the man rose, murmured a polite greeting, and shifted half a step to the right, making room. The movement was natural, forgettable. To anyone watching, it was just one worshipper yielding space to another. From the women's gallery, the asset in the dark abaya watched through the lattice, hands clasped in her ear. A faint whisper counted down the moments until the imam would begin. "All clear on the courtyard," another voice said, from a static-filled radio, hidden in a tradesman's stall outside. Guards in position, no police in sight. The call to prayer rolled through the hall, smoothing over every stray thought. Men raised their hands, then folded them against their chests. The first cycle of standing, bowing, and prostration began. It was during the second standing, when backs were straight and eyes briefly forward, that the operative moved. He shifted his string of beads from his left hand to his right, letting them dangle innocently between his fingers. As the line prepared to bow, he angled his body a fraction, closing the distance by a sliver of space measured in knuckles. When the imam's voice dipped, signaling the move into ruku, the line bent as one. In that moment of transition, as bodies folded and balance shifted, his left hand rose, as if to steady himself on al-Masri's shoulder. To anyone glancing from afar, it was a familiar gesture of solidarity between worshippers. No one could see the tiny opening between 2 beads pressed against the warm skin at the base of the commander's neck. Under his thumb, the operative felt the hidden mechanism click, a soft, almost inaudible response like a held breath being released. He counted with the cadence of the verses in his head. 1, 2, 3. The men reached full bow, backs parallel to the floor. 4, 5. As they straightened, the operative's hand dropped away, beads sliding back into a harmless arc. 6, 7. The room moved into prostration, foreheads dipping toward the marble. 8, 9, 10. When the line rose again, one man did not quite make it all the way up. Al-Masri's knees seemed to soften. His eyes blinked once as if struck by a sudden wave of dizziness. Then his body tilted, slow at first, then faster, collapsing sideways into the man next to him, who lurched in surprise as the line broke. A murmur rippled through the row. The imam's voice faltered for half a heartbeat, then steadied, continuing the verse as older men shuffled to make space, as a young worshipper cried out for water, as someone yelled for a doctor. The operative stepped back with the rest, concern etched convincingly across his face. He crouched with the others, touched the man's wrist, shook his head in sympathy when he felt no pulse. Within minutes, a small crowd formed around the fallen commander. No one saw the man in brown slip toward the back, reclaim his sandals, and blend into the stream of worshippers spilling into the courtyard once the prayer concluded. Outside, the 2 bodyguards pushed through, faces pale, one of them already shouting into a battered payphone for an ambulance and, later, for someone higher up the chain of command. By the time the first siren wailed its way through the narrow streets, the operative was already 3 blocks away, walking at an unhurried pace, beads still in his hand. A taxi picked him up on a corner that had been agreed long before. As they drove toward the outskirts, he looked back once at the minaret shrinking in the rear window, rising above the roofs like an accusing finger. Inside the mosque, Men argued over whether it had been a heart attack or a sign from God. No one, not yet, spoke the word assassination. By nightfall, the city was humming with one story. Khalid al-Masri had died in the purest way a man could, in prostration, inside the mosque. Loudspeakers called him a martyr whose heart had simply stopped while he was closest to God. Posters with his face went up so quickly the ink was still damp. To the streets, it was fate. To the movement's inner circle, it felt like a riddle with teeth. In a cramped room thick with smoke, commanders argued. Some swore Mossad had reached into the mosque with an invisible hand. Others could not accept that an enemy would dare violate a house of God. A sympathetic doctor whispered that the body did not look like a simple heart attack, that there was a strange mark at the base of the neck. Rumors hardened into suspicion, foreign toxins, unseen weapons, a ghost killing in the middle of prayer. Far away, in a quiet hotel room and a gray government office, the operation was reduced to a few lines of report. Subject terminated. No disturbance, local press calling it natural causes. There were no speeches, no medals, just a closed file and another task waiting. Yet even among allies, the method left a chill. A taboo had been crossed that could not easily be uncrossed. For a brief time, cells linked to al-Masri froze, meetings went dark, operations paused. Then a younger, fiercer successor stepped forward, wrapping himself in Khalid's memory and turning his death into a rallying cry. From pulpits and alleyway gatherings, he preached that the enemy had not just killed a man, they had desecrated a sanctuary. In distant analysis rooms, the conclusion was clinical, a precise tactical success that may have deepened the very hatred it aimed to contain. On paper, the phrase was simple, subject neutralized. In the streets, his name became a chant. Between those two truths sat the real cost of Operation Silent Minaret, a line erased between holy ground and battlefield, and a question that would outlive every man who signed the order.